Lieutenant Commander Richard Halloway stood on the bridge of the USS Washington, watching through binoculars as the USS Juneau exploded in a ball of fire that lit up the pre-dawn darkness like a second sun. The light cruiser had taken a torpedo amidships, and in less than 20 seconds, she was gone. 687 men, including all 5 Sullivan brothers, vanished into the Black Pacific. The explosion was so massive that Admiral William Halsey, watching from 40 miles away, thought an entire task force had been destroyed. But this wasn't the worst of it. In the past 6 months, the United States Navy had lost 4 fleet carriers, the backbone of American naval power in the Pacific. And as Halloway lowered his binoculars, watching oil fires spread across the water where Juneau had been, he wondered how many more ships America could afford to lose before the Imperial Japanese Navy controlled the entire Pacific Ocean. What neither Halloway nor any officer in the Pacific Fleet knew was that at that exact moment, in a shipyard 8,000 miles away in Quincy, Massachusetts, a crane operator named Thomas Brennan was lifting the first keel section of a ship that would help turn the tide of the war. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The disaster that had brought the United States to this desperate point hadn't happened overnight. It had been a slow, grinding catastrophe that began the moment Japanese aircraft appeared over Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. That attack had crippled the Pacific battleship fleet, but it was what came after that nearly broke American naval power entirely. Commander Halloway had watched it all unfold, serving on different vessels throughout 1942, witnessing each catastrophic loss firsthand. He had been a junior officer aboard the USS Lexington when she went down at the Battle of Coral Sea in May. He remembered standing on the flight deck as Captain Frederick Sherman gave the order to abandon ship. The Lady Lex, as sailors called her, had been hit by 2 torpedoes and 3 bombs. But it wasn't the initial damage that killed her. It was the gasoline vapors from ruptured aviation fuel lines that ignited in a series of secondary explosions, each one more violent than the last. Halloway had helped pull wounded men from burning compartments below deck. He could still hear their screams, still smell the combination of burning oil and flesh. 216 sailors died that day. He had survived only because he'd been topside when the final explosions tore through the ship's bowels. The crew had gathered on the destroyer USS Morris, watching from a safe distance as their ship burned. Captain Sherman, standing at the rail with tears streaming down his face, had turned to his officers and said something Halloway would never forget: "Gentlemen, we just lost 1/7 of our Pacific carrier strength in a single afternoon. God help us all." Sherman had been right to despair. The mathematics were brutal and getting worse. At the start of the war, the United States had 7 fleet carriers in the Pacific: Lexington, Saratoga, Yorktown, Enterprise, Wasp, Hornet, and Ranger. 7 carriers against the Imperial Japanese Navy's 10. Already outnumbered, and now losing ships at an alarming rate. Just 1 month after Coral Sea, in June 1942, Halloway had transferred to the USS Yorktown for the Battle of Midway. The carrier had been badly damaged at Coral Sea, with a massive hole blown in her flight deck. Pearl Harbor's repair crews had performed a miracle, patching her up in just 48 hours, though she was barely seaworthy. Fuel lines leaked, compartments were sealed off, and her steering was unreliable. But Admiral Chester Nimitz needed every carrier he could float, so Yorktown sailed to Midway with temporary repairs that would have taken 3 months under normal circumstances. Halloway served in damage control during that battle. He had been deep in the ship when Japanese dive bombers broke through the combat air patrol. The first bomb penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the hangar, igniting aircraft and starting fires that his team fought for hours. They had just gotten the blazes under control when torpedoes from Japanese aircraft struck the port side. The explosions knocked out all power. In the darkness below decks, Halloway and his men had worked by flashlight, trying to shore up bulkheads and stop flooding. The ship listed so badly that he had to climb uphill through corridors. Captain Elliot Buckmaster eventually gave the order to abandon ship. The crew evacuated in good order, disciplined even in defeat. Halloway had been one of the last off, helping wounded men into life rafts. As he floated in the Pacific, he watched salvage crews reboard Yorktown the next day, trying to save her. For a moment, it looked like they might succeed. Then, on June 7, the Japanese submarine I-168 fired 4 torpedoes. 2 hit Yorktown, and 2 hit the destroyer Hammond, which was alongside providing power. Hammond broke in half and sank in 4 minutes. Yorktown finally rolled over and sank the next morning. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. 307 men died in the Yorktown's loss, including many Halloway had served alongside. He attended a memorial service on the USS Enterprise, where Chaplain Nathan Forshee spoke words that haunted every sailor present: "We have traded 4 of their carriers for 1 of ours." In any other arithmetic, that would be called victory. But when you start with 7 and they start with 10, losing even 1 is a catastrophe we can scarcely afford. By September 1942, Halloway had transferred again, this time to the destroyer USS Laffey, escorting the carrier USS Wasp. On September 15, he watched from Laffey's deck as the Japanese submarine I-19 fired a spread of 6 torpedoes at the American task force. 3 of them hit Wasp on her starboard side in quick succession. The carrier's aviation fuel tanks ruptured, and fires spread with horrifying speed. Halloway's ship moved in close to help with firefighting, but it was hopeless. The flames reached magazine spaces, causing explosions that buckled the flight deck. After 3 hours of trying to save her, Captain Forrest Sherman ordered Wasp abandoned. The destroyer USS Lansdowne fired torpedoes into Wasp to scuttle her, sending her to the bottom. 193 sailors died in the attack and the fires that followed. Halloway stood on Laffey's fantail, watching Wasp sink beneath the waves, and did the math in his head. 4 carriers lost. 4 of 7. That left just 3, Enterprise, Saratoga, and Ranger. But Saratoga had been torpedoed and was under repair. Ranger was considered too slow and vulnerable for Pacific operations, relegated to the Atlantic. That left just Enterprise operational in the entire Pacific theater. 1 carrier. 1. And then came October. Halloway had requested transfer to the USS Northampton, a heavy cruiser, because he couldn't bear to serve on another carrier. He'd seen too many men burn. But his new assignment put him right in the middle of the Battle of Santa Cruz on October 26, 1942, where he watched the final blow fall. The USS Hornet, the last American fleet carrier actively operating in the Pacific, came under attack from waves of Japanese aircraft. Halloway stood on Northampton's deck as Hornet, just a few miles away, was hit by 3 bombs in the first wave. He could see the explosions, see the smoke rising from her flight deck. Then came the second wave, 2 more bombs and a damaged Japanese dive bomber that deliberately crashed into Hornet's signal bridge. Then torpedoes from Japanese aircraft punched holes in her hull. Halloway watched in horror as Hornet listed heavily, fires raging across her length. The task force tried everything to save her or at least take her under tow, out of range of Japanese forces. Northampton actually got a towing cable attached and began pulling Hornet through the water. But Japanese aircraft kept coming. Another bomb hit. Another torpedo. Finally, with enemy surface ships approaching, Admiral Thomas Kinkaid made the terrible decision to scuttle Hornet rather than let her fall into Japanese hands. American destroyers fired 8 torpedoes into her. 6 hit. Hornet refused to sink. They fired over 400 5-inch shells into her hull. Still she floated, burning but defiant. Finally, the American ships had to withdraw before the Japanese fleet arrived. It was the Japanese destroyers Makagumo and Akigumo that finally sent Hornet to the bottom with their own torpedoes. 140 American sailors died with Hornet. But the real loss was strategic. Halloway stood at the rail of the Northampton as the sun set on October 27, watching the last glow of fires on the horizon where Hornet had been. He pulled out his personal log and wrote words that would have ended his career if discovered by his superiors. 4 carriers in 10 months. Lexington, Yorktown, Wasp, Hornet. All gone. The Pacific Fleet now has 0 operational fleet carriers. 0. The Japanese still have 8. By every measure, we have lost this war. We simply don't have enough ships to fight them. At this rate, by Christmas, there will be nothing left to stop them from invading Hawaii or even the West Coast. I have seen brave men die on 4 different carriers. I have pulled their bodies from burning compartments. I have watched ships that were supposed to be unsinkable slip beneath the waves. And I no longer know what we're fighting for, because we cannot win without carriers, and we have none left. In Washington, D.C., the mood was equally grim. Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, sat in a closed-door meeting with President Franklin Roosevelt and the Joint Chiefs of Staff on November 3, 1942. The lights were low, and the mood was lower. King had just delivered the worst briefing of his career. "Mr. President," King said, his voice steady but his face ashen, "the situation in the Pacific is beyond critical. It is catastrophic. We now have 0 operational fleet carriers in the entire Pacific Ocean. The Enterprise is under repair after Santa Cruz and won't be available for months. The Saratoga is still being fixed after torpedo damage. The Japanese Imperial Navy currently has 8 operational fleet carriers, plus numerous light carriers and escort carriers. The numerical superiority they now possess is absolute." Roosevelt leaned back in his wheelchair, the weight of the news visible on his face. "What are our options, Admiral?" King spread his hands. "Mr. President, in naval warfare, carriers are everything. They project power across thousands of miles of ocean. They provide air superiority. They strike enemy positions before surface ships ever come in range. Without carriers, our battleships and cruisers are sitting ducks for Japanese aircraft. We can try to hold Guadalcanal with land-based aircraft, but we cannot conduct offensive operations anywhere else in the Pacific. We cannot protect supply convoys adequately. We cannot support amphibious invasions. Frankly, sir, by the numbers, we have already lost the Pacific War." The silence in the room was deafening. General George Marshall, Army Chief of Staff, finally spoke. "How long before we can replace the lost carriers?" King consulted his notes. "Under conventional shipbuilding methods, it takes approximately 3 years to build a fleet carrier from keel-laying to commission. The Essex-class program was authorized in 1940, and the first ship, USS Essex herself, was laid down in April 1941. She won't be ready until December 1942 at the earliest. The second, USS Yorktown, named to honor the one we lost at Midway, won't be ready until mid-1943. At the current rate of construction, we might have 4 or 5 new carriers by the end of 1943. But the Japanese are building too. Their shipyards at Yokosuka, Kure, and Nagasaki are producing carriers as well. We cannot build faster than they can, and we're starting from a position of having lost over half our fleet." Roosevelt was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked the question that would change everything: "Can we build faster?" King frowned. "Sir, shipbuilding is a precise craft. It takes skilled workers years to learn." "I didn't ask about conventional methods, Admiral," Roosevelt interrupted. "I asked if we can build faster. Because if we can't, then we will lose this war. So I need you to find people who can make the impossible happen. I need you to find a way to build carriers faster than anyone thinks possible. Because right now, the survival of our nation depends on it." What Admiral King didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that the answer to Roosevelt's demand was already taking shape in shipyards across America. At that very moment, while commanders despaired and admirals calculated defeat, a revolution in shipbuilding was beginning that would transform the United States from a nation on the brink of catastrophic defeat into an unstoppable industrial juggernaut. In Quincy, Massachusetts, at the Four Rivers shipyard, Thomas Brennan, a 34-year-old crane operator who had previously worked construction in Boston, was guiding a massive steel keel section into position. This was the USS Lexington, CV-16, named to honor the carrier lost at Coral Sea. But Brennan and his crew weren't building her the old way. They were about to pioneer techniques that would revolutionize naval construction. In Camden, New Jersey, at the New York Shipbuilding Corporation, a 28-year-old foreman named Daniel O'Brien was meeting with his construction team. O'Brien had been a factory supervisor at a Ford plant in Detroit before the war. Now he was applying assembly line thinking to shipbuilding, and the results were starting to show promise. In Norfolk, Virginia, at the Norfolk Naval Shipyard, a welder named Catherine Reynolds was finishing her first week on the job. She had been a seamstress in Richmond before the war. Now she was learning to weld ship hulls, working alongside thousands of other women who were flooding into shipyards across the nation. And in Newport News, Virginia, at the massive Newport News shipbuilding yard, Superintendent Harold Whitcomb was implementing radical new construction methods that would have been considered insane just months earlier. Whitcomb had worked in shipyards for 20 years, and he was about to throw out everything traditional shipbuilders held sacred. None of these people knew Commander Richard Halloway. They had never seen the Pacific Ocean. They didn't know about Lexington burning at Coral Sea, or Yorktown sinking at Midway, or Wasp's death off Guadalcanal, or Hornet's final moments at Santa Cruz. But they were about to save the men who served on those distant seas. They were about to build a miracle. And that miracle would begin with a simple but revolutionary idea: forget everything you know about how to build ships. The transformation was about to begin. The revolution began not with grand proclamations, but with a simple observation from a man who had never built a ship in his life. Harold Whitcomb stood in the main construction hall of Newport News Shipbuilding on December 3, 1942, watching traditional shipwrights work. These were master craftsmen, men who had spent decades learning their trade. They measured each steel plate 3 times, marked it with chalk, cut it precisely, then spent hours riveting it into place. The work was meticulous, beautiful even. And it was far too slow. Whitcomb had been brought in from the automobile industry, specifically from the Chrysler plant in Detroit, where he had overseen assembly line production. His boss, Homer Ferguson, the shipyard president, had given him an impossible task: cut carrier construction time in half. Traditional shipbuilders had laughed at the idea. You couldn't rush perfection, they said. Shipbuilding was an art, not a factory process. But Whitcomb saw something they didn't. He saw inefficiency. He saw workers waiting for materials. He saw each section built individually, one after another, when they could be built simultaneously. He saw craftsmen doing work that semi-skilled workers could learn in weeks instead of years. On that December morning, Whitcomb called together his senior supervisors and spoke words that would echo through every American shipyard within months: "Gentlemen, we are no longer building ships. We are manufacturing them. Starting today, we build carriers the way Henry Ford builds automobiles, and we will build them faster than anyone believes possible." The transformation started with welding. Traditional ships were riveted, a process where heated metal rivets were driven through overlapping steel plates and hammered into place. It required 2 skilled workers per rivet, thousands of rivets per ship, and the process was slow, labor-intensive, and created weak points where plates overlapped. Whitcomb mandated continuous welding. Instead of overlapping plates, hull sections would be welded edge to edge in continuous seams. The welds were actually stronger than rivets, used less steel, and most importantly, could be taught to workers in a matter of weeks rather than years. Catherine Reynolds, the former seamstress from Richmond, had been skeptical when she first arrived at Norfolk Naval Shipyard. She had sewn wedding dresses and Sunday clothes for wealthy families. Now, in late November 1942, she stood in a training facility with 200 other women, learning to weld steel. The instructor, a gruff foreman named Robert Hayes, demonstrated the technique. "It's not that different from sewing," he explained, softening his tone when he saw the women's nervous faces. "You're joining 2 pieces together, creating a seam. The difference is you're using heat and molten metal instead of thread. The principle is the same: steady hands, consistent speed, attention to detail." Catherine picked up the welding torch for the first time on November 23. Her hands shook. The protective mask felt claustrophobic. But when she struck the arc and watched the metal begin to flow, something clicked in her mind. Hayes was right. It was like sewing. She could control the beat of molten metal the same way she controlled a needle and thread, creating a straight, even seam. By December 15, Catherine Reynolds was welding hull plates on the USS Intrepid, CV-11. By February 1943, she was training other women. By June 1943, she was one of the fastest welders in the entire Norfolk Yard, capable of laying 40 feet of perfect seam in an hour, work that would have taken a traditional riveting team an entire day. And she wasn't alone. Across America, women were flooding into shipyards in numbers that shocked even the yard managers. By early 1943, women made up 38% of shipyard workers. Many had never held industrial jobs before. They had been teachers, shop clerks, homemakers, secretaries. Now they were welders, electricians, pipe fitters, crane operators, and shipwrights. At the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, a former schoolteacher named Dorothy Kimball became an expert in electrical systems, wiring the complex networks that powered carrier operations. At Brooklyn Navy Yard, a woman named Ruth Patterson, who had worked in her family's bakery, became a master riveter, one of the few traditional craftspeople still employed. Her daughter, Janet, worked alongside her as a welder. 3 generations of Patterson women, including Ruth's mother, worked in the same yard. But the real revolution wasn't just who was building the ships. It was how they were being built. Thomas Brennan, the crane operator at Four Rivers Shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts, witnessed the transformation firsthand. In January 1943, he received new orders that seemed insane. Instead of building the USS Lexington's hull from the bottom up, piece by piece, they were going to prefabricate entire sections on land, complete with internal compartments, wiring, and piping, then crane them into place. You want us to build a section of ship upside down on the ground, wire it, pipe it, finish the interior, then flip it over and drop it into the hull? Brennan asked his supervisor, Frank Morrison, certain he had misunderstood. Exactly, Morrison replied. It's faster to work on the deck when the deck is at ground level than to work on it when it's 30 feet in the air inside a hull. We build it upside down, finish it completely, flip it with cranes, and install it as a single unit. One crane operation instead of thousands of individual pieces hoisted aboard. Brennan thought it was crazy. Until he saw it work. On January 18, 1943, his crane lifted a 45-ton prefabricated section that included an entire mess hall, complete with bolted-down tables, wired lighting, and installed ventilation. The section, built over 2 weeks on the ground by a team of 30 workers, was hoisted into place in 4 hours. Traditional methods would have required workers to spend 6 weeks building the same compartment inside the cramped hull, working in difficult positions with poor lighting. By March 1943, Four Rivers Shipyard was prefabricating 70% of each carrier on land. Assembly time dropped from months to weeks. The USS Lexington, which had been laid down in September 1942, was launched in September 1943, exactly 1 year later, and commissioned in February 1944. Traditional methods would have taken 3 years. Daniel O'Brien, the former Ford supervisor now working at New York Shipbuilding in Camden, took the concept even further. He implemented full assembly line techniques. Instead of building one carrier at a time, the yard now had 4 carriers in various stages of construction simultaneously. As one moved from the fabrication stage to assembly, another began fabrication. As one was launched, another moved into final fitting out. Think of it as a factory floor, O'Brien told his workers in a meeting on February 10, 1943. Station 1 fabricates hull sections. Station 2 assembles them into larger sections. Station 3 installs machinery and systems. Station 4 handles electrical and plumbing. Station 5 does finishing work. Each station works on a different ship at the same time. The ship moves through the stations like a car on an assembly line. The workers were skeptical. But O'Brien had numbers to back up his theory. The USS Essex took 20 months from keel to commission. That was building her the old way. I guarantee you that USS Bunker Hill, using these methods, will take 14 months. And the ones after that will be even faster. He was right. Bunker Hill was commissioned in May 1943, just 14 months after her keel was laid. The next carrier, USS Wasp CV-18, named to honor the carrier lost in 1942, took 13 months. USS Hornet CV-12, honoring the Hornet lost at Santa Cruz, took 13 months. Yorktown CV-10, the second ship to bear that name, took just 16 months, but only because she was one of the early builds before all the new techniques were refined. The speed was unprecedented. But it wasn't just speed. It was scale. By mid-1943, American shipyards were building Essex-class carriers simultaneously at 6 different yards: Newport News in Virginia, Fall River in Massachusetts, New York Shipbuilding in Camden, Brooklyn Navy Yard in New York, Philadelphia Naval Shipyard in Pennsylvania, and Norfolk Naval Shipyard in Virginia. Each yard was building multiple carriers at once. The supply chain stretched across the entire nation. Steel came from Pittsburgh mills, where blast furnaces ran 24 hours a day. Aluminum came from Alcoa plants in Tennessee, where new smelting techniques produced lightweight alloys for aircraft elevators and superstructures. Arresting gear cables, the thick steel ropes that caught landing aircraft, came from factories in Ohio. Boilers came from Babcock and Wilcox plants in multiple states. Turbines came from General Electric and Westinghouse facilities. Radio equipment came from RCA. Radar systems, the new technology that was revolutionizing naval warfare, came from secret laboratories and rushed into production at electronics plants. 40mm and 20mm anti-aircraft guns came from factories that had been making automobile parts 2 years earlier. Every single component was standardized. A pump manufactured in Detroit fit a carrier being assembled in Philadelphia without modification. Electrical panels made in New Jersey could be installed on a ship in Massachusetts. Damage control equipment was identical across all carriers, so crews could transfer between ships and immediately know where everything was located. The standardization extended to training. The Great Lakes Naval Training Station in Illinois became a massive carrier training facility. 2 old paddle-wheel steamers, USS Wolverine and USS Sable, were converted into training carriers on Lake Michigan. They had no hangars, no armament, just flight decks welded onto paddle-wheeler hulls. But they worked. From 1942 to 1945, over 17,000 pilots qualified for carrier operations on those 2 ships. They practiced takeoffs and landings on a pitching deck, learned to catch arresting wires, experienced the terror and exhilaration of carrier aviation, all in the relative safety of a freshwater lake. The program was so efficient that by mid-1944, the Navy was qualifying 600 new carrier pilots every single month. Back in the Pacific, Commander Richard Halloway, who had witnessed the loss of 4 carriers in 1942, was now serving as executive officer on the USS Essex herself, the lead ship of the class, which had been commissioned on December 31, 1942. He had been transferred from Northampton in January 1943, and he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Essex was unlike any carrier he had served on. She was bigger than Yorktown and Hornet, displacing 27,000 tons compared to their 20,000. Her flight deck was longer and wider, capable of handling more aircraft. She carried 90 aircraft compared to the 80 on earlier carriers. Her anti-aircraft armament was formidable: 12 5-inch dual-purpose guns, 32 40mm quad mounts, and 46 20mm guns. Earlier carriers had been vulnerable to air attack. Essex bristled with weapons. Her armor was better, her damage control systems more sophisticated, her compartmentalization more extensive. Watertight doors and fire suppression systems were built into every section. She had redundant electrical systems, redundant steering, redundant engine rooms. She was designed to take damage and keep fighting. But what amazed Halloway most was this: Essex wasn't alone. In March 1943, USS Yorktown CV-10 joined the fleet. In May, USS Intrepid and USS Lexington CV-16. In July, USS Bunker Hill. In August, USS Wasp CV-18. In November, USS Hornet CV-12. By December 1943, Just 1 year after Admiral King had told President Roosevelt that America had 0 operational carriers in the Pacific, the United States had 7 new Essex-class carriers in combat, plus Enterprise and Saratoga from the pre-war fleet. 9 carriers. In 1 year, the United States had gone from 0 to 9. And more were coming. The Japanese noticed. Commander Shinji Takahashi, a veteran Japanese naval officer who had fought at Coral Sea, Midway, and Santa Cruz, wrote in his diary on January 15, 1944, "We destroyed 4 American carriers in 1942. They were devastating losses for them. We celebrated those victories, believing we had crippled their naval power for years. Now, in 1944, I count 9 American carriers operating in the Pacific. 9. We have gained nothing. For every carrier we sank, they have built 2 more. Our intelligence reports are even more alarming. American shipyards have 15 additional Essex-class carriers under construction. 15. How do you fight an enemy that replaces losses faster than you can inflict them?" Takahashi's concerns were well-founded. On June 19, 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the greatest carrier battle of the war, he witnessed the full extent of American production firsthand. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded the Japanese mobile fleet with 6 carriers: Taiho, Shokaku, Zuikaku, Hayo, Junyo, and Ryuho. Facing him was Task Force 58, commanded by Admiral Mark Mitcher. Mitcher had 15 carriers, 7 Essex-class fleet carriers: Essex, Yorktown, Intrepid, Hornet, Wasp, Bunker Hill, and Lexington, 8 Independence-class light carriers built on cruiser hulls, and Enterprise. 15 carriers against 6. The numerical superiority was crushing. The battle, which American pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, was a massacre. Japanese aircraft, flown by poorly trained pilots who were replacements for the skilled aviators lost earlier in the war, were shot down in waves. American combat air patrols, guided by radar, intercepted Japanese formations before they reached the carriers. Of 373 Japanese aircraft that attacked, 243 were shot down. American losses were 29 aircraft. Commander Takahashi, aboard the carrier Zuikaku, watched in horror as wave after wave of Japanese aircraft failed to return. "It's not a battle," he wrote that night. "It's slaughter. Our pilots have 3 months of training. Theirs have 2 years. Our carrier's number 6. There's number 15. We launch 50 aircraft. They launch 200. Every metric of this war now favors America. We cannot win. We can only die bravely." 2 Japanese carriers, Taiho and Shokaku, were sunk by American submarines during the battle. The Japanese mobile fleet, which had dominated the Pacific in 1942, was effectively destroyed as an offensive force. It would never again be capable of serious operations. Meanwhile, in American shipyards, the production continued to accelerate. By late 1944, Essex-class carriers were being commissioned faster than crews could be fully trained to man them. USS Ticonderoga in May 1944. USS Randolph in October. USS Bonhomme Richard in November. USS Leyte in April 1946, after the war ended, but completed in just 15 months from keel laying. In total, 24 Essex-class carriers were built. 14 of them saw combat in World War II: Essex, Yorktown, Intrepid, Hornet, Franklin, Lexington, Bunker Hill, Wasp, Hancock, Bennington, Boxer, Bonhomme Richard, Leyte, and Kearsarge. Several others were commissioned too late to see action but were completed and served in the post-war Navy. The scale shocked Japanese commanders who survived the war. Admiral Somu Toyota, who commanded the combined fleet in 1945, looked out at Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945, as Japan formally surrendered aboard USS Missouri. Surrounding Missouri were over 100 American ships, including 17 carriers of various types visible from the deck. Toyota later wrote, "In 1942, we sank 4 of their carriers and believed we had dealt them a mortal blow. We were fools. For each carrier we sank, they built 6. We destroyed Lexington, they built a new Lexington. We sank Yorktown, they built a new Yorktown. We destroyed Hornet and Wasp, they built new ships with those names. And they didn't stop there. They built Essex and Intrepid and Bunker Hill and a dozen others. We thought we were fighting a nation. We were fighting an entire industrial continent. The numbers told the story. Japan built 17 carriers of all types during the entire war. The United States built 141, 24 Essex-class fleet carriers, 9 Independence-class light carriers, and 108 escort carriers. The American industrial base, once it fully mobilized, produced carriers at a rate Japan couldn't match even in theory. But beyond the numbers were the people. Catherine Reynolds, the seamstress who became a welder, worked at Norfolk Naval Shipyard until the war ended. She had personally welded sections of 7 different carriers. After the war, she returned to Richmond and opened a dress shop. She never talked much about her war work until 1985, when she was invited to a reunion of shipyard workers at Norfolk. She was 68 years old by then, a grandmother with arthritis in her hands from years of welding. She stood before a crowd of former workers and said something that captured what they had all felt. They asked us to do the impossible. Build ships faster than ships had ever been built. They told us America was losing, that we had no carriers left, that if we didn't work miracles, we'd lose the war. So we worked miracles. We worked 12-hour shifts. We worked through holidays. I missed my son's 8th birthday welding on Intrepid. I missed my daughter's high school graduation finishing Hornet. But I'd do it again. Because every carrier we built meant our boys in the Pacific had a chance. Every ship we launched was a promise: you are not alone, we are with you, we are building you the weapons to win. Thomas Brennan, the crane operator from Fore River, had similar memories. He worked on 6 Essex-class carriers during the war. After the war, he returned to construction work in Boston. In 1992, at age 84, he attended the decommissioning ceremony of USS Lexington CV-16, the ship he had helped build 50 years earlier. Lexington had served longer than any other Essex-class carrier, finally retiring after half a century of service. Brennan stood on the pier, tears streaming down his face, watching the old carrier for the last time. A reporter asked him what he was thinking. "I'm thinking about 1942, Brennan said. I'm thinking about when we started building her, when America had no carriers left, when everyone said we'd already lost. I'm thinking about how we proved them wrong. This ship fought in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. She trained thousands of pilots. She served for 50 years. And we built her in 17 months. People today don't understand what that means. Ships were supposed to take 3-4 years to build. We built her in less than a year and a half. And she wasn't the only one. There were 23 others just like her. That's the miracle. Not that we built great ships. That we built them so fast, built so many, that the enemy couldn't keep up." Harold Whitcomb, the superintendent who revolutionized shipbuilding methods at Newport News, lived to see the impact of his work. He remained in shipbuilding after the war, eventually becoming president of Newport News Shipbuilding. In 1960, the yard built USS Enterprise CVN-65, the world's first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. Whitcomb, by then 72 years old, stood at the launching and was asked how the new Enterprise compared to the Essex-class carriers he'd built during the war. "Enterprise is more advanced, certainly," Whitcomb said. "Nuclear power, better radar, guided missiles. But the Essex-class carriers were special. We built them when the nation was desperate, when we were losing, when victory seemed impossible. We threw out every rule of shipbuilding and wrote new ones. We trained people in weeks who were supposed to need years of experience. We prefabricated sections that were supposed to be built in place. We used welding instead of riveting. We built ships on assembly lines like automobiles. And it worked. Those 24 carriers didn't just win the war. They proved that American industry, when fully mobilized, when driven by necessity, could accomplish anything. Commander Richard Halloway, who had survived the sinking of Lexington at Coral Sea and witnessed the losses of Yorktown, Wasp, and Hornet in 1942, retired from the Navy as a Rear Admiral in 1965. He had commanded carriers during Korea and served in the Pentagon during the early years of the Vietnam War. In his retirement speech, he spoke about 1942. "I wrote in my log that we had lost the war. I believed it. For carriers gone, none left. The mathematics were clear. But I didn't account for the American worker. I didn't account for the welders and the crane operators and the electricians. I didn't account for the women who left their homes to build ships, or the men who invented new ways to build faster. I calculated defeat based on what we had lost. I didn't calculate what we could build. That was my mistake, and it was Japan's fatal mistake. They counted our losses. They should have counted our shipyards." The final Essex-class carrier, USS Philippines CCV-47, was commissioned on May 11, 1946, nearly a year after the war ended. She served until 1958. The last active Essex-class carrier, USS Lexington CV-16, wasn't decommissioned until 1991. She's now a museum ship in Corpus Christi, Texas, a monument to the shipbuilders who created her and the 23 others like her. In the end, Japan had been right to be shocked. In 1942, they had sunk 4 American carriers and believed they had won the Pacific War. By 1945, America had commissioned 24 Essex-class carriers alone, plus dozens of other carriers, hundreds of destroyers, thousands of landing craft. The industrial might of the United States, once fully mobilized, was unstoppable. But the real story wasn't the ships. It was the people. The welders and crane operators, the electricians and pipe fitters, the seamstresses who became shipwrights, the teachers who became engineers, the farmers who became mechanics. They worked in shipyards from Massachusetts to Virginia, from New York to Pennsylvania. They worked 12-hour shifts, 6 or 7 days a week. They sacrificed time with their families, missed birthdays and holidays, worked through injuries and exhaustion. And they built 24 Essex-class carriers in less than 4 years. They built them faster than anyone thought possible. They built them better than previous carriers. And they built enough of them to ensure that America would never again face the desperate situation of October 1942, when 0 carriers stood between the United States and defeat. They didn't just build ships. They built victory. They built freedom. And they built a legacy that would endure for generations, the proof that free people, working together toward a common goal, can accomplish the impossible. The Essex-class carriers stand as monuments not just to American naval power, but to American industrial might, to the ingenuity of workers and engineers, and to the determination of a nation that refused to accept defeat. When Japan sunk 4 carriers in 1942, they thought they had won. They didn't realize they had awakened something far more dangerous than battleships and aircraft. They had awakened the full industrial capacity of the United States of America. And that was a force no navy on Earth could defeat. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.